From ripping someone in half to using animals for torture, there exists some brutal punishment that might scare the whole of humanity. Let's tell you about some of the most evil punishments from around the world. Crushed by elephants are playful animals. Still, no one dares to go near them, as their slight touch to your body can make you fall on the earth. This was an awful method of execution for rebellions, primarily practiced in ancient India and Southeast Asia, as it was a common habitat for the elephants. Here, elephants were provided proper training by their trainers to ensure the trampling was as brutal as possible for the guilty. During execution, the criminals were left restricted in front of a big elephant, which would be commanded to crush them like hell by stepping on them. This cruel method of execution was used by the kings in front of the public to leave a deep fear in people to prevent them from breaking any rules and regulations of the country. If you think dying after being stomped on by an elephant is bad, wait until I tell you about the next one, which might leave you scared: rat torture. After hearing about rat torture, many of you would be recalling the scene featured in the film Too Fast, Too Furious and the series Game of Thrones. In this horrifying punishment, a hell-hungry or diseased rat is laid down in a bucket on the target's undressed stomach or chest area. The bucket is then given heat from outside, and the disturbed rat chews its path through the unlucky person's muscle tissue and goes on chewing any organ it encounters in its path. While all this is going on, the victim keeps dying in pain, but remains hopeless. The past two cases that I discussed in this video were related to animals, but what if the punishers are human themselves, and they do the same thing that rats and elephants did? Sounds scary, right? Let me introduce you to some of the scariest inhuman executions served by the humans to the victims. Blood eagle. The blood eagle is one of the most infamous punishments known to exist. It arises from Nordic legends of Viking death penalties. This punishment involved immense brutality in which the condemned's back was torn to give access to the ribs, which were then crumpled upward to appear like the wings of an eagle. To provide more harm and injury, salt was sprinkled into the wound. After torturing enough, the lungs were then withdrawn from the body and wrapped over the rib wings for effect. There is still controversy about whether this punishment is still in practice or has vanished. If your heart has started beating faster after hearing about this one, then hold your heart because it might come out of your body when I introduce the next one. Ling chi. Have you ever heard the word inhuman? Ling chi is a synonym for it. Ling chi, also referred to as slow slicing or death by 1,000 wounds, was a terrible method of tortuous execution in China. It was used in the 10th century and survived for almost 1,000 years. In this inhuman and brutal punishment, the convicted was bound to a post and pieces of skin and limbs were removed bit by bit, and it would end in an ultimate cut to the heart or decapitation. That's a very brutal way of execution that anyone can ever dream of. However, it was banned in 1905, and luckily didn't repeat again. In the previous cases, I discussed executive punishments based on damages through weapons and animals. But how scary will it be if the punisher is none other than earth elements like fire and water? Believe me guys, nothing can be more brutal than the next two cases that I'm going to discuss. Hold your heart tightly, as there's still a fair chance for it to come out. Boiling. This has to be one of the most terrible ways of execution of all time. Imagine having to sit in boiling water while your body burns and you don't die immediately, suffering all this pain. That has to be terrible, right? They say burning alive is the worst form of pain, and we can argue burning would be a close second. Centuries ago, boiling was a common method of execution from East Asia to England. The offenders were undressed and then placed in a vat or pot of boiling liquid, generally water, oil, or tar. It sounds quite horrible, but believe me, it existed. For a more gruesome experience, the offenders could be pulled out of the boiling water and then placed in a cool liquid. After some time, they used to be placed again in the same boiling liquid, and this series of events kept repeating again and again for 2 hours until they finally died. And still, we're not done. Gridiron. In the previous case, we saw the harsh act of fire and liquid on the offender's body, but this case is entirely brutal and hellishly painful. Let me give you a clue. Have you seen roasting chickens or animals for eating purposes? You must have seen that, as it's not a big deal. But what if I tossed a term? Roasting alive humans? Quite awful and scary, right? But it really used to happen in ancient days. The gridiron was basically a grill for roasting the Christian martyrs. It just appeared like an iron grid and was out over a fire or burning coals. To ensure proper broiling, some people were even dipped in oil first and then placed in those grids for roasting. These brutal punishments were used to punish the criminals, rebellions, or anti-national people, so that the others think 100 times before committing such mistakes. Also, these were the cases that were primarily meant for executions. But now, I'm going to introduce you to some scary punishments that would kill the offenders 100 times before they die. Keel hauling. Have you ever heard the word keel hauling? This punishment is related to the barnacles on the ship's bottom, also known as keel. And hauling means to pull something with effort. If we combine these two terms, then we can decode the term keel hauling. This cruel punishment was primarily used in the Dutch Navy for the sailors in the late 16th century. In this scary punishment, the offenders were bound using a rope and hauled underwater from one of the ships to the other. Sounds crazy? During the punishment, many offenders died from the practice due to suffocation underwater or internal injuries. It feels quite scary just to listen. But this wasn't enough. As a gift, the offenders who were served with keel hauling punishment were often cut brutally by the keel of the ship. Yes, it's the exact thing that I discussed with you in the beginning. The keel of the ship used to leave deep scars on the offenders that they had to carry for their lifetime. Quite painful, right? But in defense, these kinds of harsh punishments were very common and generally aimed at making the legends stronger both mentally and physically. If the sockets of your brain have been blown out just by hearing about keel hauling, then you might want to take a moment to reset, as I'm going to discuss a punishment so simple that it will shock you. White torture. While hearing about the term torture, many of you were thinking about something like psychological torture, but believe me, it's even more than that. Before going to the explanation, just take some time and imagine that you are in a room where everything is of the same color, including the walls, the objects, your edibles, drinkables, etc. Sounds strange, right? This is the exact concept of white torture. White torture is a kind of sensory deprivation, mainly used for the prisoners. In this mental torture, the prisoners are forced to live with only white color in their environment, where everything is just white and white, including the guard's dress, the prison's walls, the prisoner's clothes, and food items, etc. Doesn't sound too bad, right? But once you suffer from this, you'll be very disturbed. Our brains are programmed to see colors, and if something goes monochrome, we simply can't process it. And that's similar to sitting in a place with utter silence. This may not sound too bad, but when you suffer from these conditions, your brain crashes out, you get bored to death, and your body reacts in weird ways. Obviously it does. In addition to the white colors, the lights of prisons are also kept open throughout the day and night, and no words are spoken 24/7. You would be wondering about the effect that it has on prisoners. Let me introduce you to a similar case that came out in the year 2004. Fakava was imprisoned in his native Iran and sentenced to white torture for 8 months. When he was freed from the prison, he reported that he was no longer able to remember anything, even his parents' faces. This torture completely changed his life and left him with a deep scar for a lifetime. Quite sad, but it's true. Isn't that insane? For this punishment, our bodies turn against ourselves. Well, this is it for today's video. Which one of these was the worst? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.